Babylon is often remembered as a city that fell because its walls failed. The image is familiar. Gates opened, defenses bypassed, an empire undone by an external force strong enough to break it. But Babylon unsettles that image. Because when the city changed hands, its walls were still standing, its institutions still functioned, its rituals continued on schedule. The machinery of power did not collapse. It remained intact, almost indifferent. What failed first was not the city's strength, but the reason anyone felt compelled to defend it. We tend to believe that power ends when it is visibly defeated, that authority disappears when it can no longer enforce itself. Babylon suggests something quieter and more difficult to accept. That power can persist in form while emptying in substance. That an empire can survive its own logic long enough to become replaceable. This inquiry examines Babylon through the domain of historical power, but not as a story of conquest alone. It looks at how authority behaves when it becomes too complete, too stable, too assured of its own permanence. Not to identify a single mistake, but to trace a pattern, one that appears whenever power mistakes continuity for legitimacy. For centuries, Babylon was not simply a city-state or a dynasty. It was a governing center that organized space, labor, belief, and obligation across a vast region. Its authority reached beyond military dominance. It was administrative, economic, ritualized. Power was written into contracts, recorded in archives, enacted through calendars and ceremonies. Rule was not just enforced, it was normalized. This mattered, because Babylonian authority did not depend on constant coercion. It depended on predictability, on the sense that the system would continue tomorrow exactly as it had yesterday. Taxes would be collected, temples would operate, officials would adjudicate disputes. Order was not dramatic, it was procedural. At its height, this produced extraordinary stability. The empire absorbed conquered populations rather than erasing them. Elites were co-opted. Local customs were managed, not destroyed. Diversity was converted into administrative categories. Power did not need to announce itself loudly because it was everywhere. But this kind of authority carries a hidden cost. The more power is embedded in structure, the less it depends on the presence of the ruler. The king becomes a node within a system rather than its sole source. Continuity replaces initiative. Preservation becomes more important than response. Over time, Babylon's kings inherited a framework that had already decided how authority should look. Their role was not to redefine power, but to maintain its appearance. Ritual obligations mattered as much as political ones. Festivals affirmed cosmic order. Titles echoed ancient victories. The past was not a reference point, it was a justification. This produced an illusion of inevitability. Babylon seemed unchallengeable not because it was constantly adapting, but because it did not appear to need to. Its authority was assumed. Resistance was rare, not always because it was impossible, but because alternatives felt unthinkable. Yet beneath this stability, alignment began to loosen. As the empire expanded and consolidated, the distance between center and periphery grew. Decisions made in Babylon traveled outward through layers of officials. Information traveled back slowly, filtered, standardized. Authority became abstract. Loyalty shifted from individuals to offices. Obedience was procedural. This worked well when the system was responsive. It worked less well when conditions changed. Military command became centralized. Provincial governors operated within rigid constraints. Innovation was possible but risky. Stability was rewarded. Deviation was suspect. Over time, the empire optimized for preservation rather than adjustment. The result was not immediate weakness. It was rigidity. Babylon's power did not erode evenly. Its economic capacity remained immense. Its symbolic prestige endured. Its institutions continued to function. But the relationship between authority and belief shifted. Compliance increasingly rested on habit rather than conviction. People obeyed because the system was there, not because it persuaded them that it must remain so. This distinction matters. When Cyrus of Persia approached Babylon, the empire was not in a state of collapse. There was no widespread rebellion tearing it apart from within. The city was not starving. Its administration was intact. And yet, resistance was minimal. Ancient sources describe a transition that was surprisingly orderly. Temples were respected. Officials retained their roles. Records continued. The change in rulers did not require dismantling the system. It required occupying it. Cyrus did not need to destroy Babylon's power. He needed to inherit it. This reveals a critical fracture. Babylon's authority had become so systematized that it no longer required Babylonian rulers, specifically. The empire had trained its subjects to obey structure, not source. To comply with procedures, not with a particular claim to rule. When a new ruler promised continuity rather than disruption, the incentive to resist diminished. This is often framed as betrayal by elites or weakness among defenders. But that interpretation assumes that loyalty was still anchored to Babylon as a unique center. It may no longer have been. Authority had become interchangeable. Babylon's system could persist without Babylon's kings, and once that became possible, the empire's power was already broken in principle, even if not yet in appearance. This is the paradox. Babylon did not fall because its system failed. It fell because its system worked too well. It standardized obedience so thoroughly that allegiance no longer depended on belief in Babylon itself. Power endured as form, but its meaning shifted. The empire continued to look inevitable long after it stopped being irreplaceable. This kind of failure is difficult to recognize from within, because nothing visibly collapses. There is no moment when alarms sound. Institutions continue to operate, rituals repeat, authority still speaks in familiar language. But something subtle has changed. Defense feels optional, resistance feels unnecessary. The system no longer asks to be protected, it simply waits to be occupied. At that point, power is no longer contested, it is transferable. Babylon mistook endurance for control. It assumed that because the system persisted, its authority remained intact. But endurance can hollow power as easily as it preserves it. Repetition can drain meaning from symbols. Continuity can weaken commitment. The empire's final vulnerability was not external pressure alone, but internal predictability. It had become legible, manageable, successor-ready. This pattern does not belong only to the ancient world. It appears wherever authority prioritizes preservation over responsiveness. Wherever systems become so complete that they no longer require justification. Wherever power assumes that survival is the same as legitimacy. And this raises a more unsettling question, one that does not remain in Babylon. How does power recognize the moment when stability turns into fragility? When continuity stops reinforcing authority and begins to erode it? Babylon did not see that moment clearly. It could not. From inside the system, everything still functioned. The walls were strong, the rituals correct, the records precise. What changed was quieter, the willingness to defend the system itself. Power often imagines its end as dramatic, as overthrow, as force meeting force. Babylon suggests a different ending, one where power dissolves into its own structure, where authority remains visible but unprotected. The secret of Babylon's fall is not hidden in a single decision or betrayal. It lies in a pattern of governance that confuses permanence with security, that believes repetition is proof of legitimacy, that mistakes the absence of resistance for the presence of belief. Empires rarely announce when they become replaceable. They continue as they are, assuming that what has endured will endure again and again, until someone else steps into the space they no longer feel compelled to defend. Babylon's power broke not in a moment of defeat, but in a moment of quiet transfer, when authority changed hands without changing shape. And the reason that still matters is not because Babylon was unique. But because this pattern does not end with ancient walls or lost empires, it repeats whenever power survives its own meaning. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.